Olá, eu sou a prof. Sabrina Banqueves Fadanelli e nós vamos falar um pouquinho em inglês sobre o ensino de língua inglesa para os adolescentes e um pouquinho sobre o ensino de vocabulário também. Let me share my screen with you. So here you go, teaching EFL to teenagers. Some tips and factors that are useful when teaching high school students. First and foremost, we have to ask ourselves, what exactly do teenagers want, right? What exactly do they want from us as teachers? What exactly do they want from their parents? So I found a sentence that, in my opinion, summarizes quite well and it applies to a lot of contexts. But emotionally speaking, at an emotional level, the teenager wants to escape but also have the freedom to return at any time and receive the same level of affection and support that was received during childhood. And this is not only from parents, and this is obviously assuming that this teenager actually received the affection and support from the parents or from any parent figure, because we know that families are different. But this is also from the teacher, and from any kind of instructor, because we understand that when children are younger, when they go to school, they have all that sense of novelty, that sense of creativity that is stimulated on children, and there is a lot of play involved together with the activities of the school. And we feel that when teenagers are in their schools, this sense, of discovery, this sense of interest for learning is starting to be lost, right? Because schools seems a lot more like an appointment or a responsibility. And then that side in which, young people want to learn, want to participate in activities is a bit forgotten. And our jobs as teachers is to try to, rescue that feeling, especially language teachers, because we have a lot of tools in our hands in terms of we can work with any topic we want, we can work with anything, because language is in anything and in everything. So we have this facility, we have this possibility. And this is something very positive, and we should definitely use it to our advantage. So our students, they can feel, they feel still like they're becoming adults. They want to escape the world of childhood, the world of playfulness, but they understand that they need this as well to learn, and this also creates an environment for learning that is very positive, and that is very, I would say, supportive, right? So I think this sentence is actually very good, and it's something that makes us reflect quite a lot, right? Teenagers, they're effective language learners, but why? Exactly for the reasons I mentioned before. They combine childlike playfulness with adult-like ability to hypothesize and think critically. So they have the playfulness of a child. A lot of them still have, I would say most of them, some more, some less, but they are, cognitively speaking, already, able to make abstract hypotheses. They think critically, and they're able to process things cognitively quite fast. Different from children who still are, in the phase of forming their cognitive skills. And this makes teenagers the most effective language learners, according to research. Before we actually go for tips specifically, I think it is always important to bring back the classic Douglas Brown's effective principles. Douglas Brown, in his Principles of Language Teaching book, he mentions, cognitive principles for language learning, affective principles, and linguistic principles. And here we're going to focus on the affective principles because I think they are, crucial. I invite you to read the whole text. I left there for you on Ava the material with the affective principles, the full material. But I also invite you to read Douglas Brown's book, which is a very important piece of material for language teaching and for language teachers. What are the four affective principles here? The language ego, the self-confidence, risk-taking, and the language culture connection, right? So I'm just gonna show you here briefly about the language ego. Here is the summary of the language ego principle, right? As human beings learn to use a second language or a foreign language here, or Douglas Brown uses second language, we can definitely stretch our thinking, the same thinking to our environment of foreign language. So as human beings learn to use a foreign language, they also develop a new mode of thinking, feeling, and acting, a second identity. The new language ego, intertwined with the first language and the second language and the foreign language, can easily create within the learner a sense of fragility, a defensiveness, and a raising of inhibitions. And what does that mean exactly? It means that we need to be careful with our students because they're creating this new identity inside the language, the other language that they're learning, and they're not sure of themselves. They are afraid of making choices that might lead to mistakes and feeling ridiculed and feeling laughed at because of these mistakes, or feeling judged by the teacher, right? So it is very important to create this environment in which they understand that this new identity, this new, I would say, this new persona of the student is being created, and where they can actually make mistakes, and the learning process is what matters, and not really a result, or a result of a test, or result of a task itself, right? And also, to help this, it's also important for teenagers. Teenagers are competitive by nature, but they are much more prone to cooperation. Their age, calls for working with peers, working with groups, not necessarily only in a competitive way, but much more in a cooperation way. So, fomenting this and focusing on tasks that are going to get them to cooperate with their peers will also help in developing this language ego principle. When we talk about self-confidence, the word itself says, right? But here we have a very important description of the principle of self-confidence, which is strictly connected to the language ego principle, is that learners' belief that they indeed are fully capable of accomplishing a task is at least partially a factor in their eventual success in attaining the task. So this belief that they're capable of learning, even if they have some difficulties, even if they, will maybe not use the language directly or indirectly, so much in a near future, this is something that will definitely influence if they learn or not, right? So we as teachers, we need to be watching and giving tasks to our students that will challenge them, of course, but we'll also get them to believe that they are able to produce something in the language, that they are able to learn, that they are able to understand the language itself, right? Risk taking is totally connected to the two previous ones. And here we have successful language learners in their realistic appraisal of themselves as vulnerable beings, yet capable of accomplishing tasks, must be willing to become gamblers in the game of language, to attempt to produce and to interpret language that is a bit beyond their absolute certainty. If language ego has been fomented and they understand that they're creating this new identity, and they also are given self confidence enough to understand that they're able to learn. Yes, maybe they have some more difficulty than this or that person, but they are still very, very capable of learning. Um, they will understand that for us to learn language, we need to use language. And when we are using language, we're going to make mistakes. Sometimes we're not going to use the correct grammar. Sometimes we're going to use the wrong word, right? Or a word that is not adequate for that moment specifically. And then when students realize that, when we design activities and we try to foment this kind of thought in classroom, students will learn better because they will feel that, okay, I am here and I'm taking a risk and I'm gonna learn from this risk, because I'm gonna learn either if it is okay, and I'm even gonna learn a lot more if I make a mistake, because I'm not gonna forget about that, because I tried and I connected that to communicative instances. And then the last one is the language culture connection, which is quite, self-explanatory, but I think we can take a look at something very specific. Is whenever you teach a language, you also teach a complex system of cultural customs, values, and ways of thinking, feeling, and acting. No language comes detached from a whole cultural system. And that is why I say that language teachers, they have a richness of material to work with, because just working with these cultural elements, differences of customs, differences of countries, differences and similarities also of ways of thinking and doing things and routines, you can already teach a lot of things in the language. And then it's important that the students also are given this point of view, that they need to learn the language. They also need to learn how to think in a different way. This, for teenagers, also improves their ability to connect with other cultures, to be more tolerant, and to be aware that they are not the only ones in the world, that are other people with different feelings, with different ways. Sorry for the interruption. So here are some tips that I think we can use as language teachers, especially when working with teenagers, right? So find your shared interests. You will have some shared interests, whether it's music, TV, movies, or Anita's latest tweet, right? I'm mentioning Anita because last week she was top one, right, on Spotify. For example, this is an example, but we can always find, as language teachers, common interests with our students, and this will get us closer. Of course, especially if we're in a group with a lot of students, still we might be, find common interests in music with that group, or in programs with the other TV programs with the other group. And then our job is to try to find these connections and try to find the things that also they like, and to be willing to listen to the things they like, to watch the things they like, to use the things they like in classroom. Because if we give them this space to bring things that they are interested in, to learn the language, they will also feel part of the process, right? So this is something really interesting and really important. Have them answer questions as if they were a certain character. We tend to use the same language when always talking about ourselves. We always say the same thing about ourselves. We always say the same things in the same way. But if they have to think from the perspective of some fictional character, this usually pushes them to be more creative with their answers and to use English vocabulary that in other, when they were just talking about themselves, they wouldn't work with, right? So role playing is always a very good way of getting teenagers to communicate and to talk about specific characteristics without having to talk about themselves only. Find topics that are relevant to them. When it comes to discussing current events or debating common issues, teenagers struggle much more than older learners. Sometimes they haven't given it enough thought to have developed opinions yet. And sometimes they honestly just don't care. It's like, did you care much about politics at 15 or about, I don't know, environmental issues or stuff like that, right? So, conversation and debate topics need to cover something they have direct experience with. It's hard for them to sustain the kinds of hypothetical debates we typically have in adult speaking lessons, even though cognitively they are very capable of debating these kinds of topics. They many times weren't given enough information, or the kinds of news that they're reading and they're exposed to are different, and they don't involve a very adult-like topics to discuss. But it is also always possible to get a topic and make the bridge and give them enough information, bring them articles and information to feed them so that they will be able to discuss that with more passion or with more interest, right? Teenagers know the rules, right? They know the rules of the school, they know the rules of the English class. Sometimes it's nice to let them break the rules. Well, they can't really necessarily break the rules of the school. They not necessarily should break the rules of, interacting with people, respecting each other. But one thing they can break is grammar rules, right? So one of the most fascinating things about learning a language is learning what's not in the books. And then letting them know that not everyone will speak perfect grammatical correct English all the time, just like people don't speak perfect grammatical Portuguese all the time. Nobody does that all the time, right? So language is constantly changing, and that's what makes it so interesting. So it is important to bring them, okay, you can get the rule, you can get them to understand the rule and how the language works, but it's always a nice way to bring songs or examples of movies or series or even other kinds of material that will show, okay, this is how formal language operates, but look, this is how people communicate and this is how people change the language. The verb to be is very easy to do that. For example, you teach the verb to be, you work with the verb to be, but you can also work with the very, very common construction ain't, which is something that happens a lot, and it means the same as the verb to be. And you can, bring songs, show it in movies, and get them to understand that's how some people use the verb to be to communicate, right? This is an example. In general, in the early teens, students tend to be fascinated by extremes and things that are completely outside their everyday existence. Hence, they're interested in, for example, the Guinness Book of Records. They're also interested in positive human traits such as courage, perseverance, creativity, and they look for role models who represent these things. So here we have a bit of a little bit of help on on how to choose certain topics for our lessons, right? On how to improve the topics that are proposed by the books. And then as teenagers grow older, more towards the end of high school, they begin to become more philosophical in the sense that they want to understand how the world and how society works. They start to get interested in greater ideas, meaning that they start understanding, ways that the world can work that might be better than what we have nowadays, for example. So these topics are also recommended as teenagers, move towards the end of their school life. We should always be careful with compliments, right? And we should never focus our compliments on the right answers, but we should praise positive behaviors, right? So do not praise the right answers only, but praise mostly positive behaviors such as effort, creativity, cooperation. And then research shows that praising for teens is most effective in improving learning and self-esteem when it is linked to the student's effort rather than their performance. And be careful with being too much, using adjectives such as brilliant or fantastic when they have actually done something that is the case, right? Because teenagers see that we're exaggerating, and that sounds a lot fake, right? And sometimes this cooperates for them not to form a very good image of the teacher. They want the teacher to be sincere, they want the teacher to be truthful for them. It's also important to pay attention on how we ask questions. When asking students something, ask the question first and then name a student to answer it. In other words, avoid saying something like, Raphael, what's the answer to number 3? But say, what's the answer to number 3, Raphael? That makes a lot of difference because if you first say the student's name, like Raphael, anyone who is not Raphael is not going to pay attention. However, if you say the question first, you stimulate them that you're always going to do that. You say the question first and then you name the person. All of them are going to pay attention to the question. And it's very likely that they are going to pay attention to the answer as well, right? It is important to pay attention to wait time, right? And what is wait time? It is the gap between a question that is being asked and a response to be presented. Research shows that prolonging the wait time by 1 to 2 seconds results in more student reasoning and better responses. So ask a question and then insist that no one respond for at least 2 seconds so that they have time to think before they speak. In this way, you're not going to give a chance to answer only to those who are already very familiar with the language. Get them to get used to, get them to understand that when you ask a question to the whole group, they shouldn't answer right away. There should be some wait time for everybody to process and think, and then other people might be given a chance to answer, not only the ones that always answer or the ones that are very good at the language. This is also very important. Make sure you design activities in which they have to pay attention to their peers, not only the teacher. It is very common for students in this age, students in general, but teenagers are very prone for that they only listen to the teacher and they don't pay attention where their classmates are saying something. Language learning experience is much richer if they listen to the whole group, not just the teacher. They can learn a lot from their peers, a lot from the ones that maybe know a little more English, or even the ones that know less, because there might be ways in which they're going to try to communicate and in which they're going to learn something, right? So it is important to always have in mind, for example, if you're going to design an activity in which they have to interview each other about their routine, don't get them only to interview each other. Get them to interview each other, and then they're going to have to tell a third person about what they asked to their other classmate, or they're going to have to tell the teacher. So they're actually going to have to pay attention to what the other person said, make notes, and then deliver this information to another person. This is an example, right? When teaching teenagers, we teach grammar, we work with grammar, we work with pronunciation, but a lot of the teaching is going to be focused on vocabulary. The first thing, it is very old to say that, but it is important to always pinpoint that a picture is worth 1,000 words. And in this case, we always have to be very visual. We have to teach vocabulary, not only using flashcards, but if possible, use Google Images. Be careful, test before, because some really crazy things can appear. Get them to look for pictures of the things you're working with. Get them to try to seek visual aids, right, for what you're teaching them. So it is also always important to make them visualize using, the board, using the projector, using any resource that you might have at your hand. It is important to remember that people learn or memorize vocabulary through two kinds of relations. And this is not me inventing, this is research that has already shown that this happens, right? The kinds of relations that our neurons make. And then specifically for learning vocabulary, we learn vocabulary through syntagmatic relations and paradigmatic relations. Let's talk about each one of them differently and separately. So when we talk about syntagmatic relations, we're talking about language phenomena such as collocation, which is how we combine, how we make combinations of things, how things combine in the language. This is collocation. And also associating words by the same semantic groups. So for example, a good example of collocation is students would understand, or a native speaker even would understand that if there was an accident, you're going to say that my car was damaged in the accident, and you wouldn't say your car is injured. But you're not going to say my father was damaged in the accident. No, you're going to say my father was injured in the accident. So this is what we mean by collocation. What are the correct combinations in language that will associate that message better? And then, for example, associating words by the same semantic groups. For example, when you think of the act of eating, to eat, the verb to eat, what do you associate with this? Okay, you associate the food, but you also associate all other things. You eat on a table, you eat your meals on a table, you maybe the oven, the pan, the kitchen utensils you eat. You associate kinds of restaurants or tastes. So all of these are involved in the semantic groups that is involved in the act of eating. Children and preteens, they tend to learn vocabulary much best through syntagmatic relations. And that is one thing that people who work with children and preteens need to keep in mind. But we're talking about teenagers. Teenagers will learn through syntagmatic relations, but also through paradigmatic relations, which means using antonyms, synonyms, hyponymy, morphosyntactic constructions. So, for example, the antonymy, like wet versus dry, using the synonyms for amazing, like incredible, stunning, wonderful. And then using hyponymy, which is like, okay, I have a word that describes a big group, like furniture, and then you get them to separate chair, desk, wardrobe, get these words under that hyponym, right? And then it also, morphosyntactic on a lesser scale, not using necessarily the names, but getting them to understand the functions of a verb, what is the infinitive, an adjective, a noun, right? And then adults and teenagers, they learn through both syntagmatic and paradigmatic relations. So it's important that when we design activities to work with vocabulary, we remember that we need to tackle for teenagers syntagmatic relations and paradigmatic relations, so that you have a good source and a good amount of input of vocabulary so that they can practice and they can memorize a little better or with more facility, right? What are the factors that affect or contribute to vocabulary acquisition? First of all, the frequency. We can't expect our students to learn and memorize, a couple of words or a list of words, not a very big list, but anyways, 10, 12 words. If we don't get them exposed to these words in a very specific, contextualized, and contextualization is the next factor, right? Or in different ways, in different, again, using paradigmatic and syntagmatic relations. Why, for example, students learn very fast that went is the past of go, because go, it is one of the most frequent verbs, and when we work with them with the past, we ask them what they did in the weekend, they usually say, I went to the park, I went this, I went that, right? And so the frequency of use makes them memorize and makes this automatic, right? It automatizes the process of using language. So we need to give our students enough practice in the meanings of being frequent and constantly returning to that vocabulary in different ways. Pronunciation. Pronunciation is key to memorization. If we students tend to memorize, the graphic or the spelling of the word, but it aids a lot in memorization. It aids a lot in vocabulary acquisition. If we tackle pronunciation, we get them to practice pronunciation, not only with the repetition exercises. There are lots of other possibilities to practice pronunciation, not only repeating, but associating the sounds that they're producing, getting them to pay attention to the stress, patterns of stress, how the vowels are pronounced, how the consonants are pronounced here. So pronunciation is also a key factor that affects and contributes vocabulary acquisition. And then, like I said before, contextualization. There is no vocabulary acquisition without a context, because vocabulary, it's like a real meaning of a word. It's always going to depend on where it is being used. And then this is something that is very, very important to point out to students and get them to understand that the different contexts in which that word can be applied or used, right? So here's a little review of what I've just said. Reviewing vocabulary in different contexts is important for frequency, for pronunciation, for lower and higher levels, both, right? We tend to focus on pronunciation on lower levels, and we think that higher levels don't need practice of pronunciation. That's a big mistake, because we need to practice pronunciation for vocabulary acquisition as well. And then in contextualization, not only teach words making use of pictures and flashcards, but also complement this teaching with examples, full sentences, activities, songs, things that contextualize the vocabulary, perhaps in different ways as well, right? And then when we are thinking of acquisition of vocabulary, we need to think of the relationship between input and storage, right? Input is, how they receive the vocabulary and how they, receive the information. And storage obviously refers to how they memorize it, right? So we need to understand that the depth of processing when the input occurs has to do with working actively with meaning, right? You can use a variety of techniques. And then the better the emotional response to word, the better retention it will have. So they will definitely learn faster the words and the chunks of word, the chunks of language that have to do some sort of, that enunciate some sort of emotional response, which has to do with, this is relevant to them. It has something to do with their lives. It triggers some sort of feeling in them, even if it is a negative feeling, but it still can be like that, right? And then when we think of storage, okay, they have acquired that vocabulary, and then how are they going to store it better? Building word networks, right? There will be what we call semantic clusters, which is how that chunk of language is going to associate with things they already know. And then the teacher can help this, by bringing in topics in which they can connect things. And then we need to pay attention to this specific idea of lexical sets versus the distinctiveness hypothesis. What exactly is this distinctiveness hypothesis? Items are easily learned if they are not similar, right? So the less similar they are to the mother language or in between each other, the easier they're going to be learned. Things that tend to be very similar have a bigger difficulty to be stored. The best example we can think is all of those words starting with the th, thought, though, thorough, right? They're very similar and they have a very difficult way for people to learn them, right? And so lexical sets, they should be when I talk about lexical set, I'm talking about not just one word, but the word together with what's going to accompany it, right? Together with other elements that are frequently found with that word. And also preferably not put things together, as in they're very similar in terms of spelling or in terms of pronunciation. It's going to be a lot more difficult for the student to learn. So it's better to get things that are quite different. They belong to the same semantic category or similar semantic categories. You can make semantic connections between the words, but they are not supposed to be so similar in terms of spelling or pronunciation or function, grammatical function, for example, right? And then, of course, we have cultural factors that affect acquisition of vocabulary. When we think of a word, or we think of a concept, like we think of a bird, all of us have what we call a prototype in our minds. So when I imagine a bird, in my mind, maybe a canary comes to mind. Maybe in other people, a person or a teenager who lives in a farm or environment, they will have a prototype of a bird in a different way. So we have a lot of cultural factors that affect the acquisition of vocabulary, because the concepts related to things, especially concrete things, but also abstract things, is going to change depending on how the child grew up, and more specifically, this teenager, what is the environment this teenager has grown up and is actually being exposed to. And we also have schemata, which are mental representations associated with a word, which are activated in the mind, right? And then this schemata has to do with, okay, I have a prototype of what a bird is, but then the teacher tells me the word bird and brings a bird that is very different from the bird that I had in my concept. The teacher brings instead of a canary, the teacher brings the picture of a pelican, right? Or a toucan. And then what's going to happen? The person is going to look for that concept of bird inside their minds, the canary, for example, the canary, and is going to connect, okay, this pelican has feathers, has wings, it flies, so it has similar characteristics to my canary. So, okay, it's going to be my bird. It's also a bird, right? So you see, the mind is going to work with the prototype, and then the schemata is going to bring the characteristics that are going to make that picture with the word bird associate with the previous concept of bird that I had in my mind. So this is also important to consider when we are developing activities for vocabulary acquisition. So here are some of the references that I've used in this presentation. I hope it has been useful for you, and I am available for any questions, okay? recommend that you read these material because they are very interesting sources to learn not only about teenagers, but language learning, language teaching in general. Thank you so much, and I will see you in the next class.